Good evening and welcome to the fifth and final public session of our 8th annual Touro University, California Social Justice and Public Health Speaker Series, hosted by the Public Health Program. My name is Gail Cummings, and I am the Program Director for the Public Health Program here at Touro University, California, and I am joined by Dr. Deirdre Wilson, Co-Coordinator of the Social Justice and Public Health course and co-moderator of today's session. The topic of this year's series has been and is economic and political inequality, a threat to public health, which is a follow-up from our series last year, which focused on public health and well-being in a time of COVID-19 and racial injustice. This year's series, we've been examining those issues more broadly with a more upstream approach and an analysis that has been exploring the intersections and influences of our nation's policies, politics, and economics as critical determinants of health. So to help us understand and untangle these uproot causes, implications, opportunities, and solutions of these critical determinants, we've been hosting leading experts in the field of public health and social justice from across the country and state, as well as from here in our local community of Solano County. Today, we are thrilled to host our final session to wrap up this amazing season with a national perspective on strategies and solutions that address and advance population health, well-being through applied epidemiology, the law, and public health policy. But before we begin with today's session, even though we are continuing to meet virtually, we are all currently sitting on or standing on what is Indigenous territory. And with the permission of Corina Gold Ohlone Leaner here in Solano County, I would like to acknowledge that Touro University, California sits on the traditional territory of the Karkin Ohlone, who have lovingly stewarded this land for generations. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Deirdre Wilson, Chair of the Community Health for Action Concentration, for some housekeeping, and she'll introduce our panelists today.
Good evening, everyone. Just as a reminder, we are recording this session. I'm going to share my slides. Well, if I can get to them. We are recording this session, so our Zoom recording policy is here. And to our TUC students, this is a required course for all incoming IMPH students, so please check Canvas. A roadmap for this evening, Dr. Frank Franklin will present an overview of the strategies and solutions of political and economic inequality and its impact on inequalities in health. And so this will wrap up our session for this year. And we're looking forward to some of those strategies and solutions and the Q&A session that will follow. If you have any questions, please hold those questions for at the end of the presentation and put your questions in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. We're also offering both CME and CPH credits. If you're interested in the Certified in Public Health credits, please go to the National Board of Public Health Examiners to sign up for the credits. The CME credits are on the following slides. I will also put the CME credits in code in the chat for those who are coming in now. We also offer the Social Justice Lecture Series digital badge for those who are interested in receiving a digital badge for the 2018 through 2021 series. You're able to view those previous presentations and earn badges for each of those years. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Frank Franklin, who is the Deputy Health Commissioner. He has Commissioner of the Philadelphia Health Department. He has a background in injury epidemiology, forensic epidemiology, health policy, and law. Before his role as the Deputy Health Commissioner, Dr. Franklin served as the Director of Epidemiology, Analytics, and the Evaluation Division at the Multnomah County Health Department. He also had the opportunity to work with an integrated substance use treatment and primary care agency as the Director of Treatment and Prevention Services. Dr. Franklin received his doctoral training at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. He also earned a master's in public health and completed postdoctoral training in health policy from the Morehouse School of Medicine. Dr. Franklin also holds a Juris Doctorate from the Klein School of Law at Drexel University. He is a member of the National Board of Scientific Counselors of the National Center for Injury Control and Prevention at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And throughout his career, Dr. Franklin served as a public health practitioner and his work reflects a commitment to advancing population health and well-being through applied epidemiology, the law, and public policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Franklin.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for that introduction and embarrassing me. I always sort of like, okay, when is this part going to end? But no, thank you for the warm introduction. I really appreciate it. Before I start, I would also like to thank Dr. Gail Cummings, as well as yourself and the whole Touro University family for inviting me to be a part of this 8th annual Social Justice and Public Health and Lecture Series. I'm truly flattered and humbled and delighted to be here. So what I'll do, I'll just step right into this and try to make this as much as a conversation as possible, given that we have a time to do this. So I'm excited about that. So the title of my now, can you guys see my screen or?
No.
Okay, let me see if I can share that. I'm about to get started and it's not even. Can you see it now? No. Let's see. I think this is the right one. How about that?
Yes.
Okay, now let me, when I came out of this, it kind of does a reset here. So let me do this. All right, are you guys still good? Wonderful, yes. Wonderful. So the title of the presentation is Racial Economic Inequality in Public Health. And what I want to do, sort of level set a little bit and give you guys a little sort of context for sort of how I got here and a context for how you got here. You may be wondering to sit here and listen to me talk for about an hour. So as Dr. Wilson said, I have a background in epidemiology, forensics, and the law. So most of my work has been in public health and in courtrooms and things like that. So at some point in my career, maybe about 8 years ago or so, 8 or 10 years ago, I was asked to do a series of publications and blogs on different issues. And two of those issues centered around sort of Black men and mental health in the Black male, and also this thing around what often is referred to, and I like to call it structural violence, and the violative lived experience of the Black, brown, and the poor. And just to give you like a little, I'm going to show you how savvy I am here. Let's see if this works. So I wrote these articles and discussed some issues going on at the time. And from that, I was asked to participate with some of my colleagues. Can you guys see that? Okay, yeah, great. Some of my colleagues in higher education. I think one of the benefits of, I know one of the benefits of sort of being an epidemiologist, I get a chance to sit in a lot of different spaces. So in working with my colleagues in higher ed, I was sitting on a panel around sort of dealing with STEM and neighborhood effects that may impact people's participation or Black and brown children's participation into STEM in high school and in college. And we got to talking about we got to talking about the notion, and at that time, and it's still very popular, you know, the school to prison pipeline. And for me, I, just as everyone else, I got accustomed to sort of saying it, and it was sort of just sort of matter of fact or casual. And as an epidemiologist, one of the things that we always want to know is sort of the how and why, the mechanisms behind certain phenomena. And I was sort of surprised or distracted by how we had sort of taken for granted that this pipeline existed, but no one really sort of, at least up to for me, no one really explained to me sort of why is there a pipeline, right? And what's driving this pipeline, right? Because it becomes sort of a known or acceptance, like there's this pipeline and we have to work to sort of counterbalance the effects of this pipeline. So with that, I used the school to prison pipeline to examine race, poverty, and public health outcomes, and to sort of narrow the lens or sort of focus on that through the lens of this pipeline or the school to prison pipeline, and then look at the trajectories that are shaped by race and poverty and have outcomes or have implications for well-being and health status. And one of the things I talked about is sort of the role of, or the narratives of the Black and brown child, and particularly the African-American male. And one of the things I noticed when I was doing my research to try to get this presentation together and examine some of the mechanisms behind the school to prison pipeline, one of the things stood out for me was this idea that the narrative of the African-American male, it was characterized, or it is often characterized by what I call a perpetual inquiry of identity permissibility. And this narrative exemplifies a lived experience of boundaries and freedoms fundamentally shaped by this social construct of race. And when you look at that and on balance with his white male counterpart, his narrative is more a sort of what I call a narrative of perpetual prerogative, right? So there's this idea of permissibility, can I be, versus why wouldn't I be? So in examining this pipeline, if you will, or examining sort of what was going on behind the Black child's experience and why was he or she, and I'm going to use he here because there was a particular interest in Black males, but why is he more likely to go to prison from school? And the short end of it is, what I found is that a lot of children in public school settings, which are all more likely Black and brown, experience a lot of chronic stress, cumulative stress, distressors, stressors before they even come to the classroom. And sort of this sort of being chronically vigilant and sort of always on heightened sense of awareness. And these things sort of create challenges for emotional responses, and it eventually sort of leads to disruptions in effective emotional regulation for the child in the classroom setting. And the two most important environments that sort of impact the trajectory of whether a child will succeed in school, or hence in this case, the outcome of going to prison, the two most important environments is the home environment as well as the classroom environment. When you think about it, this is where the child spends most of his or her time in those formative years. And so this chronic exposure to stress has an impact, a negative or adverse impact on the neurological infrastructure, and impeding sort of optimal development of what is called executive functioning. So essentially what you have is a day-to-day experience of the cognitive act of consistently tracking and managing distractions and classroom directions. And that sort of evolves into a source of constant aggravation and frustration, particularly when the child's emotional functioning is underdeveloped. Neurocognitive difficulties turn quickly into academic difficulties. And this sort of less than optimal executive functioning leads to a slippery slope of deficiencies, stigmatization, inability or to read on time, grasping a sense of numbers. And those are the sort of two primary areas when you're thinking about coming into those formative years of preschool, heading towards elementary school, heading towards middle school. And this slippery slope. So schoolwork gets harder, students fall further behind, students feel bad about him or herself being in school, then it's more stress. And one of the things that I found in the literature was very popular and well known now, what I call this third grade phenomena. Sort of, the literature pointed to at third grade, you could that was a pivotal point to be able to determine or discern whether or not a student would more likely to fail or succeed or go to prison or be justice involved. And I couldn't quite figure out at the time, like, what was so significant about third grade? Like, why not the fourth grade? Like, what's happening? Why not the second and third or fourth and fifth? And after sort of careful consideration, what I sort of realized and came to understand is that, up until that point at grades 1 through 3, the goal is sort of teaching the student how to read, right? Or learning how to read. But the fourth grade is sort of transitions into reading in order to learn, right? Reading to learn versus learning to read. And so the expectation shifts. So the student, therefore, the assumption is the student is proficient in his reading skills. And therefore we can now transition him into this position of, well, now let's read to learn, as opposed to us teaching you or you learning how to read. And once the academic coursework becomes more complicated, they fall behind, students feel bad about him or herself, causes more stress, can lead to behavioral problems, which leads into, again, to stigmatization and punishment. So then you have this cycle that goes on from bad school experience, stigma, punishment, higher stress, harder to focus, and it just goes on from grade to grade. The stigmatization and punishment encourages the maintenance of amplified stress levels, and a major factor behind this predisposition for poor executive function is the child's exposure to adverse childhood experiences. And then this gets us into sort of a brief overview of what the adverse childhood experience is, or how it's sort of categorized in the literature. And there's three main areas of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And I think most people are more intimately aware, or it's more popular. There's more sort of a popular awareness around abuse and neglect, but less around sort of household dysfunction. Often we talk about sort of housing stability in terms of whether or not the person is transient or sort of this living in a stationary household. However, you could have a house or be stationary and have a home to live in. However, when the household is dysfunctional, it too is still not considered stable housing, right? And wow, this thing here is moving around a lot for me. So, and the greater, sort of the more exposure we have to the number of ACEs, it sort of increases the number of traumatic experience, or you consider that equivalent to increasing the number of traumatic experiences. And then that's associated with poor psychological development, and again, back to this executive functioning and the capacity to learn effectively. So what I found, sort of looking at what I call the ACE experience, sort of then the next question for me as an epidemiologist is sort of how is this experience distributed across various populations or throughout the US population? And what we found is across all groups compared to white children, African American and Hispanic children were exposed to more adversities, right? You have individuals with African American individuals with at least one ACE. And I think I should have the race here, but I don't have them in. So what I think, if I recall correctly, what we have is sort of the number of African American and Hispanic children with at least one ACE, and then the number with two or more ACEs. For all ACE events, the prevalence of exposure for are highest for the poorest children, which was at least twice as high for the poorest child or the poorest children compared to children of higher income households. And exposure to more ACE events based on the relationship with income also differed by race and ethnicity. So in generally speaking, poorer children, regardless of race and ethnicity, have a greater or more vulnerable to and have higher exposures to ACE experiences or the ACE narrative. But that is further sort of amplified or when we look at race in terms of between races, we find that although poor, the African American or the Black and brown children are disproportionately impacted by poverty, so their numbers or their ACE experience is still slightly higher. And so this is the fast forward to sort of that work. Some colleagues who worked on a paper for the Journal of School Health, and I was an editor there, editor for this project because of my work around structural violence and sort of looking at the school context as a place where violence is further amplified for the child who comes from a violative experience. And simply put, here you see the macro level forces, pervasive violence, race-related trauma, whether it's symbolic or institutional in the school context, leads to a traumatic experience, then racial discrimination, alienation, violence, and other forces where you have sort of micro level forces that can be physical as well as psychological. And from there, you have symptoms of anxiety, depression, externalization, which is thinking about sort of core regulatory capacity around emotions, acting out or being bad, as we would say, or as the school context would say, and internalizing behaviors. Now, looking at these macro level forces in the school context, they're often embedded in a context of racial economic inequality. All economically disadvantaged groups, racial and ethnic minority population experience higher morbidity and mortality as it relates to the relationship between economic disparities and health outcomes. And the relationship between racial and economic inequality and health status in the United States appear to be inextricably linked. In 1995, compared to whites, African Americans have 1.6 times greater overall mortality rates, and it was no different from the mortality disparity observed in 1950. A study in Baltimore looking at individuals in Baltimore, a longitudinal study, looked at approximately almost 4,000 SES diverse African Americans. And what they found importantly here in this study is that the impact of economic status extends beyond the individual as well into the neighborhood. So there is sort of the individual poverty status, which contributes to the relationship between economic inequality and poor health status. But there's also an independent effect from the neighborhood context as well. What they found here was sort of what's called a sort of a synergistic effect between gender, race, and poverty status. So essentially, African American men living below poverty had the lowest survival rate or the highest mortality rate. African American women living above the poverty had the highest rate of survival relative to the African American men. But in terms of race and gender, you had sort of the greatest synergistic effect in how income inequality or poverty status exacerbates or increases the opportunity for a shorter life period, living sicker and dying quicker, as they would say. And there are various reasons for some of this, and most of them lie in the space of structural processes or stratification processes. So while still enduring the vestiges of racial segregation and residential segregation, African Americans contemporarily face occupational segregation, income segregation, and economic redlining to this day. So despite some of the declines in these racial segregation, and still dealing with the impact of racial and residential segregation, we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis as we speak in terms of occupational segregation, income. And since the 1960s, income and educational differentials have persistently widened. Underlying the widening health disparities and increases in income and wealth inequality, despite controlling for education and income, African Americans consistently come out, are more likely to present with higher levels of poor health. So education and income can serve as a buffer. It sometimes weakens the relationship, but it never extinguishes the relationship, or the relationship is always statistically significant and in the same direction. So essentially, race and ethnicity shapes what I call the benefit burden distribution across the lifespan due to social positioning, and that structurally produces differential access to resources and opportunity. The modest gains from the civil rights movement and its attending legislation have been essentially, or I like to say, constructively neutralized by the larger opposing macro-social and macroeconomic forces of income inequality. And this is a diagram here that sort of, I adapted this from a paper by Ogunwale and Golden, looking at diabetes. But when you look at the sort of the diagram here, all of this was centered around diabetes. You can almost put anything in here and get sort of to the similar endpoint. We have racism, which is one of those structural determinants of health, and sort of shapes people's positioning in society, as we all know. Racism, or the racialized experiences that other groups have, in spite of the fact of not necessarily being African American or Black or brown. For instance, you have sexual orientation, you have individuals, English as a second language, or people with disadvantages shaped by the fact that they're not a U.S. citizen. They may be an immigrant or refugee. So they often experience what's called a racialized experience, because it's essentially a lot of those practices of discrimination are derivative of the fundamental roots of racism. So we have the residential segregation, we have the discrimination, socioeconomic deprivation, which leads to poor educational systems, overcrowding housing, increased environmental toxins, again, the discrimination, the depression and chronic stress, or adverse life experiences when we're talking about adults, right? So you have this sort of perpetual cycle of adverse child experiences, and the source of that is being in households with adults who have a cumulative narrative, or a narrative that has an accumulation of adverse life experiences. Then that leads to underinsured, limited healthcare access utilization. And then you sort of in the middle, you have these sort of what they call the cumulative biopsychosocial vulnerabilities and resistances, low literacy, educational attainment. Again, most of the children who have been exposed to the ACE narrative come from poor families that are either undereducated or underemployed. So they lack opportunities, or their parents or their caregivers often lack optimal opportunities for education and employment, leading to low birth weight, which is still an issue that's ongoing for African American women, independent of their education and income. And here, this slide ends with disparities due to premature morbidity and mortality. So whether it's diabetes, whether it's cancer, whether it's cardiovascular disease, whether it's injury, we see a similar pattern here that can sort of be plugged into this diagram in terms of how racism contributes to the racial and income inequality that we have. So with that said, a lot of sociologists, a lot of public health literature looks at the role of social determinants of health and how they're shaped by the structural determinants of health, and talk about these sort of socialization processes. But often there's less conversation around some aspects of culture that may arise from individuals who live or who have an accumulation of adverse events over their life course. But then there's this concept, or what we're all experiencing in the United States, around economic inequality, the sort of the 1% effect, where we have a small percentage of the population or the distribution of income gains are sort of skewed towards maybe the top 5% of the population, whereas the income inequality that we've been experiencing in the last 20 years or 30 years disproportionately impacts middle class and poor individuals, sort of the shrinking of middle class America. But when you think about the middle class and the sort of poor strata, African Americans are disproportionately sit in the middle class or sat in the middle class and sat in the poor categories. So we have these gains, and for over 50 years, the gap in income and earnings between African Americans and whites have persisted and increased. So after the 1968 Civil Rights Act, the median family income for African Americans was 57% of that of whites. Nearly 50 years later, in 2016, the median income was 56%, basically no change. And the question sort of then arises, well, why is that? How could that be? Is it all, can we all attribute that to racism or socialization processes? And some of the common explanations include the Black-white differences in returns for education, level, or work experience. Again, the occupational segregation, family structure. Many of these explanatory frameworks point to the burden of discrimination or discriminatory practices and conditions among African Americans, despite being similarly situated with their white peers. Occupational segregation via race. So essentially, that focuses on who gets the jobs, right? Whites and Blacks, and as we experienced and was sort of pointed out and highlighted and underscored during the COVID pandemic, whites and Blacks hold very different jobs. And who gets which jobs sort of shapes how Asian and income, there's still another level of segregation happening. In the skill and occupational hierarchy, African Americans may have similar gains to whites, but more often, even if they do, it's not equal. But let's just say they're more similar than dissimilar. Their white counterparts are often either have less experience, have less formal training, and simply one or more notches below them. So you don't get this sort of, you have sort of one group who on paper, you may be similarly situated in terms of positionality at your workspace. However, what it took to get there or the rate of gains for the white counterparts are often higher, or there's a greater velocity to receive gains for their efforts compared to their Black counterparts. Within jobs, African Americans earn less than whites who are observationally similar, which is even more pronounced in higher status occupations. Again, the differences in family structure, most African Americans, or there's a disproportionate number of African Americans who come from single family households. And research has consistently established that compared to their white counterparts, Black applicants with identical qualifications are less likely to be offered interviews, callbacks, in both low wage and high qualification labor markets. And then this moves us to this idea of national income inequality. Independent of structural stratification processes, or in addition to the consequences of being exposed to the structural violence of racism and its racialization apparatuses, the persistent and pervasiveness of economic inequalities can also be attributed to larger microsocial factors. Real tax incomes for the richest 1% of society has risen by a factor of 3 since 1970, while incomes for the poor half of society have remained stagnant. Between 1947 and 1973, family incomes grew more than 2% a year. Only since 1973, it's only the highest quintile who has experienced growth beyond 1% a year. So for 48 years, the African American family income rose from the 25th percentile of the national distribution to the 35th percentile. So although there's been substantial progress during those 50 years, the rates of income inequality just have consistently risen at the same time. The increasingly rising rates of income inequality in the United States has the severest impact on the middle class and the poor strata of society. So essentially what we have is these gains over the last 50 years, important, but even with the gains, they haven't been on par with the white population. But nonetheless, the gains have been almost completely counterbalanced or neutralized by the rising income inequality of the United States of America, which is why we see the stagnant numbers. In short order, again, the African American community stands in as the canary in the coal mine. The currency of the American dream for African Americans does not necessarily exchange for similar values or bargaining power compared to their white counterparts. Fundamentally, the uphill climb to racial economic parity is steeper than it was when the Civil Rights Act was passed. So here we have, in 2016, 12% of whites, but only 4.4% of Blacks were in the richest income decile, meaning whites were 2.71 times more likely than Blacks to belong to this select group. For me, the scenario resonates with the timeless adage and all too familiar for African Americans of 5 times is better to be half as good, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back, or arguably 1 step forward and 2, 3, or 4 steps backward. Yet, who's counting, right? Of course, 70% of the income distribution experienced the greatest income distractions. Given that whites are richer than average, a decrease in income relative to the national mean for African Americans also means a decrease relative to whites as a group. So some of the takeaways here, in addition to structural positioning, in addition to social determinants of health, there are macroeconomic forces and political changes that have an impact on the Black-white income equality gap. Although sometimes, and one author called this these facially neutral processes, which I find very interesting because when I read it, it reminds me of being racially neutral, but it's far from that, right? Broader social structures should be considered and examined more fully to understand the racial and economic inequality or the Black-white income gaps. Once structural stratification exists, increased economic inequality amplifies racial disparities. So what I found, which is a little disheartening, is once you sort of have these social stratifications, more often than not, the facially neutral policies will always have a more severe impact on those who are structurally stratified. In this case, if we're talking about race, we're talking about the Black and brown. If we're talking about, similarly with gender, right, where women often make less money compared to their male counterparts for doing the same work or having the same qualifications. So once the stratification exists, it becomes almost impossible to have larger social forces have a negative impact on the global collective and not have a disproportionate or more severe impact on those who are already stratified. And the same holds true in the opposite direction, right? Even if there was sort of, if we did not have income inequality, African Americans still would be disproportionately behind their white counterparts. Broader social structures, not necessarily rooted in racialized processes, can exacerbate the racial economic inequality. And a lot of the authors think this is important. I believe it is important to sort of understand the role of broader or what we also refer to as indirect structural conditions that impact or exacerbate the already vulnerable populations. But I do find it difficult to believe that that we can separate them from race, given the fact that it's only those who are already socially stratified. In this case, it's always sort of the Black and brown who receive the worst end of the stick, or who are consistently sort of cut off at their needs due to larger macroeconomic policies, or due to even local economic policies or decisions that are made. Similarly, right now, we're all experiencing the issue with inflation. However, the impact yet felt by all, there's a differential impact, Black and brown, for those people who are already socially stratified. So I think it's important to look at both, but I also think it's important to connect them sequentially, as opposed to thinking of them as sort of independent actors. Strategies and solutions. So I have a little context for this section, and this is when I was asked to give this talk, and even during the introduction today, I noticed how strategies and solutions sort of come out front, and I always get a little anxiety about that. And over the years, I realized, and I understand it's a reasonable question, but to be honest, I used to get a little bothered by that, and I couldn't figure out, on the face of it, it is such a reasonable question, and it makes sense, right? What are some of the solutions, Dr. Frank? How do we? You've given it all this sort of the bleak and the morbid, if you will, or the dark side of things. So then, how do we sort of address them? And after a couple presentations, maybe about 2 years into sort of thinking about not why the question is asked, but really being reflective and contemplative of sort of why I was sort of bothered by it. So here I sort of set up, this first slide looks at strategies and solutions in what I call the more traditional or the more status quo context, right? There's enforcement, there's new legislation, there's advocacy and community mobilization, which is really critical, and I'll circle back to that. Affirmative action, or what we now think of in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and often what we see in public health and in many human services industries, evidence-based or emergent practices. But what is the actual scope of evidence-based, right? So these things too are important. So I don't want to minimize them or be dismissive of the importance of enforcing existing policies, strengthening existing policies, and advocacy and diversity and equity and inclusion work. But I think what I realize is when people ask me the question of what the solution is, it gets stuck in this place, what I call the seduction of linearity, right? And what do I mean by the seduction of linearity? The issue at hand, or in this case, health disparities, and it could be any particular specific health disparity, it's treated as an off-on switch, right? Sort of, what's the pill that we take, right? How do we stop it? How do we fix it, right? Like the flat tire, we fix it and then we move on. And it seemed to sort of simplify what I think is something more complicated than that. And it didn't give enough credence to thinking about how to think about it. So it's not like a pill. Many of these things that we're dealing with are sort of beyond the scope of linearity or the on-off switch, or I have a headache, take a pill. The holy grail of evidence-based strategies. I've been in public health for 20 years, and again, I value evidence-based strategies. And but there's sort of this: what's the next best shiny penny? What's the new evidence-based strategy? Though the holy grail evidence-based strategies are often elusive. And the process of developing strategies and being innovative to confront complex health issues was sort of often not on the table. How do we eliminate the isms, the fundamental underlying sort of inquiry by some of those questions about what the solutions are, or being asked what the solutions could be and what should we do? How do we fix it? You're really trying to fix the isms. And I think that's why it often becomes overwhelming for many people. So, I've sat in many rooms and it's sort of, how do we fix racism? How do we fix genderism? How do we fix, and they don't say that, but I think that's the sort of that's happening in the background, and it creates a sense of frustration and being overwhelmed, right? Or I've been at tables where people say, well, we don't have anything to do with, we don't have anything to do with housing. That's not our lane. We're the health department. We don't have anything to do with transportation. That's the, Department of Transportation. I can't stop, the isms. And I think our role is not to sort of eliminate the isms. I think our role is sort of to think about, how do we counterbalance the ism, right? We, in public health, we are very focused with doing, or there's this sort of doing something has been sort of romanticized. We do a lot of things, but we often fall short on thinking first, right? We do, and then we go, we made a mistake, right? But there's this sort of love affair with, I'm doing something positive, I'm doing something, I need something to do, right? And then when you ask sort of, well, why are you doing that? Or did you think about this? Or, good example, right now we're dealing with some of the monkeypox the monkeypox outbreak in Philadelphia. And there was a lot of back and forth about how to communicate the population at risk. But often what we do is we stick to the facts. We know epidemiology and we know the risk population, and we just kind of go forward with that. And we're getting out there quickly. But I always say it's better to measure twice and cut once. We often cut 4 or 5 times because we really don't take the time to measure. And then how does this fit into strategies and solutions? You're probably wondering, right? So I had the opportunity, I was doing some work in graduate school in business. And one of the courses I took centered around sort of strategy development and innovation design, innovation management. And I know that the health and human service sector or the government sector is not quite exactly the same as the commercial industry. However, there are a lot of things I think that can be borrowed from business strategies and business schools to sit into, that can be borrowed from those contexts and sort of played out in the public health context in terms of moving towards solutions. But our process for developing strategy often is, I think, inadequate. We often take what's called deliberate strategy development or design process, which is stationary, but complex circumstances rapidly outpace the utility of this deliberate strategy. And generally, the deliberate strategy or the design process mandates an adaptation of the intended strategy because things are constantly changing on the ground. And there's this other approach in terms of versus a design process to more what's called the emergent strategy process. And that process reflects on a set of decisions or a decision developed to match the fluidity of reality. So is it about a strategy towards a solution, or is it about solutions to develop a strategy? And I think this is why I struggled a lot, and I think this is why public health struggles, because their process for strategy development doesn't really, I'm not going to say it's not solution oriented. It doesn't have the currency, and it always falls short for the currency of being a solution than what we hope for. So I've begun to look at this process of, instead of sort of trying to figure out what the strategies we should be doing towards solution, I think that we should have better solutions to develop strategies. And one of the things that I'm doing so here, the emergent perspective on strategy and innovation, it moves away from stationary ideas of direction and control. It evolves from a learning organization. Again, how does the organization of the program think before it actually does, right? Identifying what works one initiative at a time, population specific, and having a certain level of contextual intelligence. Synthesizing the internal and external mechanisms or factors that make interventions more successful, regardless of the similarity or dissimilarity of the intervention or the problem and the populations. So for instance, I'm developing or working at the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, and we're working on an equity strategy plan, as well as a broader departmental and strategic plan. And one of the fundamental things that is often left out in strategy development at the health departments or the public health department in general is community mobilization. Now, community mobilization is one of the central functions of public health, but it's hard to mobilize a community if you don't have a strong foundation for community engagement. And how are you doing this community engagement, right? We have, in my department, there's about 10 divisions, and everybody is doing community engagement, right? So I get that. But the level of uniformity in terms of how that's practiced is so disjointed. So maternal child family health, they have community engagement practices and procedures that look totally different from another group. And sometimes you have to have variability. So it's not about sort of one size or one sort of standardization across the board. But as an organization, as a program, there should be a shared set of tools in terms of how you are engaging communities. Because if you're not able to mobilize them effectively, then more than likely your engagement practices aren't what they could be. And so, and we often look at community engagement as an add-on in the health department, instead of it being an integral part of our day-to-day functioning and a part of our inherent strategy. It's an add-on, it's ad hoc, or it's episodic. When there's a legislative issue at hand, we go reach out and we say, hey, we need the community. Or if there's an outbreak, we say, hey, we need the community. But we don't have time, we don't even know who the community is, right? And so, and the reason why that's important, going back to these isms, when you think about race, racism, or structural stratification processes, they all have sort of the same or very closely aligned intent. It is to sort of manage one group around opportunity, or to ensure one group has is less connected to opportunity and resources compared to another group, or to subjugate one group to a set of conditions that ensure that. So the ism is pretty much consistent. When you look at racism in Dallas, it has the same intent as racism in Utah. It has the same intent as racism in Philadelphia and racism in New York. So it's not a question about whether it's racism or whether it's genderism or whether it's nationalism in terms of So discriminatory practices against individuals who are not citizens or who may be citizens but are foreign born. So these are consistent, again, no matter what country the person is from or where you find yourself, but how racism or how genderism or homophobia, how it shows up in one community or how it presents itself is slightly different. When you look at discrimination in Utah, when you look at racism in Utah, it may show up differently than it does in New York City, right? When you look at genderism or gender-related issues, the gender-related issues that a person may experience in an urban city is totally different than what they may experience in a rural city, right? Or what it looks like in one region of the country looks totally different, but it's still the ism. The ism is consistent. So that sometimes the ism can be a red herring in terms of thinking creatively about how to not fix, but counterbalance the impact of that ism as it presents itself in that space. And you cannot do that unless you have a significant or credible level of community engagement in order to mobilize those individuals to help define and come up and with the strategies to offset or counterbalance how they are experiencing racism or genderism or marginalism in their space. Marginalism is bad for everybody, but what marginalism looks like for individuals of different sexual orientation or the LGBT community, it looks different than maybe for individuals from a foreign-born country. It looks different for individuals in the South than it does in the North. And so we often come with these evidence-based strategies or the hot new shiny penny, and we're ready to plop it down without having the contextual intelligence, without really understanding how the ism functions and how it presents itself in that space, in that narrative. So we do more of a plug and play than we should. And I think it's less of an issue of whether or not we have effective strategies. It's another question of, are we using the strategies that we do have effectively? And I don't think you can do that without really understanding how the ism or how the structural positioning presents itself and manifests itself in that space. And you cannot get a clear handle on that if you don't know the people or if you're not dealing with the people who are impacted. So the solution that you use for the same ism and for the same outcome, it could be diabetes, which you may use in one part of Philadelphia, it may not be the same thing in another part of Philadelphia. How I may handle opioid use disorders or fatal and non-fatal events associated with opioid exposure, how it looks in one part of Philadelphia, it doesn't look the same it doesn't look the same in another part of Philadelphia, but it's still opioids, it's still fatality events or non-fatal events, and it's still wreaking havoc, right? And so you can't just sort of, it's not a plug and play thing. And that's why I think I get frustrated with, answer my question here, why I get frustrated with what's the solution? It depends, right? It depends on how the ism is operating. And it comes full circle to this, my sort of affinity about the how and why. What's the mechanism behind it? Not whether or not is it racism, we know that. Not whether or not is it genderism or regionalism, we know that. But what does it look like for this population? And I think, therefore, the solutions, if you will be slightly different. And we have to become less attracted to this idea of linearity, less attracted to this idea of what evidence-based practices are. And what does that mean? You have your evidence-based practice, you have your emerging-based practices, but sometimes you have to adapt, or something completely different for that context. So, and that in itself is evidence-based, right? And it's not bound by the literature, it's bound by your intimacy and your connection, systematic, ongoing, routine community engagement. You have to be there on the good times as well as the bad times. And so bring health to the people, bring well-being to the people. But what well-being looks like for me will differ depending on how the isms operate in my life. And so I don't really have a particular, here's the menu items, here are the 5 things you should do. But I do think we should come up with different types of solutions to better strategize and incorporate different things to be more innovative. And sometimes that means something new. Sometimes that means using the old in a new way. And the other things often become noise, and we're missing the signal. And the signal often lies with the people and in the context that's being impacted. So that's my rant on that. But I feel very passionate about that because I've been doing this for over 25 years, and I don't know, there has to be a better way to do it. And this is the one thing that I've seen consistently missing as we come up with new outbreaks, as we come up with it's COVID, it's monkeypox, it's polio. Now we're on alert for Ebola, right? It's one thing after the next. So how can you mobilize a community? Or it could be emergency preparedness, right? How can you mobilize a community? You don't even know who they are. So I ask you all, is it a question of strategies towards a solution or a solution towards a strategy? Clearly, I think the latter, but I would be open to hear some of your thoughts on that. And Dr. Cummins and Dr. Wilson, I hope I didn't sidestep the solutions.
Well, you definitely did not sidestep, but I'm sure a few of our few public health practitioners feel a little bit dark, a little bit in their heart.
Yeah, I think they're going to get me. I get it.
Yeah, no, I think they're. I think they and we will all really just appreciate, sort of your honesty and transparency to these, this issue. I mean, this idea of linearity is really impactful. It makes me think about Brian Stevenson has a quote. It's the opposite of wealth is justice, and so there's no, this whole idea of plug and play. You can't. It doesn't work. And I think you've opened the door to a really a philosophical question about how we approach, these issues and those contextual intelligences. So. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I know there are a few questions in the chat. I have some questions too, but I will turn it over to Dr. Wilson to begin to facilitate some Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Franklin. I mean, that's a lot of information, and we've had a few people already ask for your slides. I think it's going to take a little bit of reflection on the part of our students to kind of digest the information. But there are a few questions that came up. The first is, you discussed ACEs, but what about the resiliency scores or PACE scores? Have you considered that in your research?
I have, and it's awkward when you sort of doing this virtually, because I would ask the person, could they be more specific, right? But now I'm trying to sort of translate sort of the intent behind their question. Yes, I have considered those in my research, sort of during these talks and thinking about different variables in public health and different ways to measure effectiveness or the counterbalance adverse exposures. And I this is another thing where I struggle with, because in the field there's this sort of and I could be totally off with this person's question, so please feel free to come in and get me together in terms of if I'm sort of off base here. There's this false dichotomy between sort of strength-based and non-strength-based, or resiliency versus sort of non-resiliency, or the negative versus the positive. And I really think you have to have both, right? You have to have both. I think strategies to improve resiliency scores are important. I also think it's important to realize that in spite of all the sort of vulnerabilities of Black and Brown populations, there is a lot of untapped or unmeasured resources of resiliency. And I don't know if it's just the way the flaw of my training. Those things have been enough to allow us to survive. I question sort of the extent of the currency of those factors in the absence of not looking at other things. Will they get us to the point of thriving? And I think that's why I see those things going hand in hand, but I'm not sure it's not enough to remove the negative exposures in the absence of strengthening factors of resiliency, and nor is it enough to focus on factors of resiliency and minimize moving some of those forces that create opportunity for exposure to things that work against our health and well-being.
Thank you very much. And I do know that there has been a considerable amount of research to really look to see, why particular populations thrive. I wouldn't say thrive, survive very harsh conditions. Recent immigrant populations can survive harsh conditions, and others don't. But I think that the goal is, as you have stated, is to really go from surviving to thriving. So, and I think that's really important to know. It's good to measure kind of resiliency. Why have people been able to survive so far, or even sometimes thrive despite their circumstances? So the next is from another of our students, Fanan. It's incarceration. Incarceration is listed as a social determinant of health under the Healthy People 2030. What type of policies can we implement to improve healthcare continuity among incarcerated individuals when they reintegrate back into society?
That's a big one. It's funny that I'm aware of incarceration is considered social determinants of health. And as you were reading the question, I thought back to, in the literature, as crazy as it sounds, being incarcerated in some ways has a protective effect for African-American men, which is fascinating to me because it says less about sort of the protectiveness of prison, but it says more about sort of how eviscerating it is to be a non-institutionalized African American on the outside. But in terms of the health insurance piece, this becomes problematic in a lot of ways because a lot of health insurance regulations are driven by the state, right? So you sort of have your there may be sort of federal mandates on certain things, but how policies are implemented, executed, often depends on there's different titles for different states, but the sort of the individual who sits over the Department of Insurance or whatever it's called. So what you have in Maryland you may have a totally different, more flexible opportunities to have continuity for healthcare service for prisoners versus in Maryland versus Vermont, right? So this uniformity or this sort of patchwork makes that even more challenging. I mean, on the global sense of it, you want to ensure that that the Medicaid or expansion coverage for these individuals is consistent, but it has to be sort of low barrier, right? How do we keep the coverage, even though the individual may not have a home, or and so when they transition from prison to the next place, they have to kind of start all over again, and we have to make some of the criteria for transitioning or to be covered, if you will, less sort of barrier informed and more sort of friendly toward the individual receiving the services. And so this will look different state to state, but I think a key function of that is ensuring that the coverage remains when individuals are going in either direction, right? Whether they're going from being non-institutionalized to being institutionalized and vice versa. Now, how you do that looks different. It looks different depending on where you sit.
That's right. Yeah, and from state to state, we've talked about that in previous sessions, and we've had a couple of speakers really talk about the inconsistencies of care and laws, and for both prison and for jails locally and by the state. And it seems that healthcare provisions are also vary depending on where you are. So our next question is from yet another student, and she states, public health is often rooted in prevention and protection. You spoke about having a broader lens than the isms in public health. How can we as future public health professionals push forward the narrative of not romanticizing these issues and implement a more exhaustive process of changing the thinking around health disparities?
I don't think I'm ever going to live this one down in terms of romanticizing things, and you guys are recording this, right? So, wow, you guys ask good questions, because these are the questions that I stay up late every night thinking about. And so now I'm thinking about what is it that I do to try to push you really have to kind of push the envelope. And this is what I've come to realize. Most individuals are not necessarily resistant to change. Most people have a tendency to go to their default because that's what's comfortable, right? So I try to walk in that space to sort of keep my sanity about being confrontational or being sort of forceful about different ways to think about old problems, because there's nothing new under the sun, as my mother would say. And you simply have to not be fearful of trying something different. Leadership, to me, in spite of all the many, many books, is really more about sort of being willing to sort of move forward in a reasonable degree of uncertainty. And in public health, we have our tried and true ways of doing things, and that's what people feel comfortable about. But I think it's important to show the shortcomings of that, and not fall into the routine of the status quo. And this doesn't mean necessarily, I'm not promoting this idea of being sort of belligerently abrasive or confrontational in a negative sense, but you have to confront the practices and procedures that are in place if they're not achieving or seemingly moving in the direction which you purport or which you say you want them to go. Yeah. No, I've been doing it so long, and I try to think about how did I do it before I became deputy commissioner, and even when I was sort of more junior in the field. You have to be okay to think out the box, and you what may be good about a process, you keep that, but what's not good about it, you have to release it, or you just set yourself up for I won't say failure, but you don't position yourself to sort of move closer towards the center of equity. Do you ever get the bullseye? No, but you can't stand still. And I think as up and coming public health practitioners, you're new, you're energetic, and not that I'm that old, but don't become distracted by the way things have been done for 30 years. I don't know. And you have to be a learned individual, meaning you have to be willing to create a learning environment, a learning organization, a learning program, and be open to information that you know and information that you don't know. Yeah. I feel like I'm rambling here on that question. I need somebody to hit me a softball here.
I don't think we have any of those from our students right now. You kind of,
which is good.
Wrapping up a pretty
Wilson,
intense
can I just
session.
intersect something just to follow up on that conversation, because I'm looking at Mauna Kea, and I just want to point out she, along with a couple of other of our social justice fellows, will be discussing this this conversation after we get off the line. So I know that's why she's giving you some tough questions that are really great. But I do think, it's interesting you talked about, not leaning on these evidence-based practices, which is, of course, what we lean on in public health. And we say that over and over and over again. And I know we're all trying to encourage our students to seek out alternative, alternative models, not just those that we find in peer-reviewed, publications, for example. But just to ask another kind of question because I think I understand what Mauna Kea is asking. So what else can we do? I mean, to be brave, not not do this plug and play kind of thing. But how else do you do that?
So, and again, I don't want to beat up evidence-based strategies. So, one of the things that, as you all, I assume here we have master's students and doctoral students. Your job, and I'm going to tie into sort of and I'm going to tie it back to this evidence-based practice thing. Your job as becoming a public health practitioner, or while you're in graduate school, is to, think less about the answer and think more about the question. So, and that is critical thinking, period, right? What's the right question? Right? Because if you can't get the right question, that's not where the bread and butter is. So when we have these evidence-based strategies, I think they're important to use and look at them for what they are. But as a practitioner, you also have to be able to discern for what they are not. Right? So I sit on some of these evidence-based things with CDC, and really do a lot of great work, a lot of great things, and people put forth, different evidence-based strategies, particularly for violence. That's the area I'm very interested in, urban violence. And you read the evidence, you say, this is great. This is, I see where the strategy seems most effective, but it seems to be a little impotent in this other area in terms of retention among those who are the most difficult to reach. So when you as a practitioner see that, you then have to sort of think about first being able to discern that and spot that issue, and then develop what question needs to be asked and how do you reconcile that sort of weaker component of the evidence, because you're going into a population. I'm just going to say me, I'm going to the north rough side of Philadelphia, right? And I need to know not just how effective the intervention is on those who are more likely to some extent self-select in, but it's the hard to reach population, right? So it's not just sort of be dismissive of evidence-based strategies, in addition to looking to alternative sources of information, but being able to pull out the pieces that seem to be less effective for what you needed to do. And then how do you adapt that? Or what do you do with that then, right? Because you want to have some fidelity how you implement the program, but you can't be fearful of altering it or adapting it for the population you're trying to reach in order to save fidelity, right? And that's one of the things that I do in terms of I look at evidence, I look at data. Also, one of the things that I'm trying to pull into how we do work in public health in terms of getting at equity is there is not a lot of active, proactive, and thoughtful, purposeful engagement with the tools of public health ethics. Now, you sort of have the CDC website, and they have a great web page on public health ethics, and it's great. It reads good, it's officious. But there's a different type of public health ethics in terms of relational ethics, which is more important, or I believe a little bit more critical to when we work with Black and Brown populations. We as public health practitioners, we come in, we have our data, I'm guilty of this, right? And even though I joke on the seduction of linearity, I love linearity, right? I'm an epidemiologist, right? So I love things that are linear. But we come in with our data, we come in with our, this is a risk factor, this is that, and then we drop the mic, right? And we're expecting people to be like, whoa, I'm on board, right? But what we're beginning to see now, and you guys are coming in at a very exciting time, I guess, depending on where you sit. What we're beginning to see now is that we are in situations where we have very little information. We have very little facts, right? And the question is not, can you do something? It's should you do it in terms of the ethical implications. Will you be undermining the agency of that population? Yes, this is good. They should take the pill. They should get the shot, right? But how do you do this in a way that's ethically respectful to that group and where they sit? Not just, public health ethics in general, do no harm type thing, but sort of how do we incorporate deliberative ethical frameworks when we have to engage a new outbreak or emergency preparedness? Again, can we do it? Yeah. But should we do it? Or should we do it, but we're not going to do it, right? Because that's equally important as well. And then, so there's this space where we have very little information and we have to figure out what to make important decisions on the fly. But then there's the other space where we have a lot of facts and we have tried and true measures. But should we be doing that, right? Should we be thinking about, although contact tracing is very important to disrupt transmission, but should we sequence it differently and prioritize in a different way in order to deal with people who are asymptomatic in COVID? I think that was a big misstep we did in COVID in terms of focusing on people who are only symptomatic, when we now know that the majority of the transmission were people who were asymptomatic. But the question was about sort of how do we allocate resources? So what's the trade-off ethically in order to save the resources? But it didn't really matter whether you focus on people who were symptomatic or asymptomatic in terms of resources, because there wasn't enough resources anyway. There wasn't sort of the scenario where we have enough resources for all the symptomatic people, but not enough for the asymptomatic people. The resources are going to run out, you get more. we all know now that there was a shortage of test kits and things like that. So was it ethical to sort of only focus on symptomatic people, right? And so understanding what questions are not being asked, understanding how the evidence-based strategies, what pieces of it appear to be less useful for the populations you're trying to impact, and understanding that, and then making the necessary changes and move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. I think, one of the most profound things that you just said was
I'm feeling good now. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling better. I'm recovering.
Was about the ethics. We can do things, but the question is, should we? Will we take the agency from the communities that we're trying to serve? And I think that is hard for practitioners to balance. And I think it's something that many of our students are grappling with, as well as they try to move forward and decide kind of how they're going to do their work, be it in the clinic or as public health practitioners, how to navigate kind of the changing landscape of both public health and our society. And it's something that we do need to consider as we move forward in public health. We can do a lot of things, but the question is, should we? And to avoid kind of a paternalistic view, I think we have to also make sure that our communities maintain agency, even in the face of public health decisions. So I really appreciate you bringing that up to wrap us up for this 5th session of our social justice in public health. And I think it really wraps up our session on economics and the impact of both economics and the lack thereof, and economic inequities in the populations that are affected by economic inequities. So we really do appreciate you coming today and providing some strategies and solutions and ways to think through kind of how we should proceed as the landscape is changing, and as we really try to address the tough questions in public health. So thank you, Dr. Franklin.
You're absolutely welcome. Let me just add one thing about the strategy and solution there, so I can, another thing that we have to start doing, and we are starting to do in public health, is realizing all the players in the value chain as it relates to the production of health and well-being. Public health doesn't do enough upfront collaboration with these other players in the value chain towards health and well-being. And I think that also undermines their agility to be more emergent and be more responsive with these other players, whether it's transportation, whether it's commercial businesses, chambers of commerce, and things like that. So another solution.
That is a perfect ending to our session today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin, and many of the comments in the chat are thanking you. It was a really wonderful presentation, and encourages our critical thinking to make that and put that back in the forefront of public health.
Okay, it's my pleasure. You all have a good evening.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.